After 18 years of marriage, my wife went on a date with her coworker, so I delivered nuclear revenge. Welcome to Romance Files. Please like this video and subscribe to Romance Files. Let's begin. Malcolm never thought he'd be the kind of person to doubt his wife, Clara. In the 13 years they'd been married, he had always trusted her completely. She was a steady hand to his occasional storms, the voice of reason when he got lost in his thoughts. But lately, something had shifted. The steady rhythm of their life together had been disrupted by whispers of doubt, quiet moments of unease that Malcolm couldn't ignore. It had started small. A change in her tone when she spoke to him, a sudden guardedness around her phone. Clara, who used to share everything with him, now seemed to exist in a world he wasn't a part of. At first, Malcolm chalked it up to stress. Her job at the marketing firm had grown more demanding, and she often came home late, exhausted but smiling faintly. He wanted to believe her when she said it was just work, but a gnawing suspicion told him otherwise. One evening, as Malcolm sat in their living room with a book, he couldn't focus. Clara breezed through the front door, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. She was glowing in a way he hadn't seen in years, and for a moment Malcolm felt a pang of hope. But then he caught the faint scent of cologne, one that wasn't his. "Long day?" he asked casually, though his heart pounded in his chest. Clara smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You could say that. We had a team dinner after work." "Sounds fun," Malcolm replied, studying her face for any signs of guilt, but she was unreadable, her expression a carefully constructed mask. As Clara disappeared into the bedroom to change, Malcolm sat frozen on the couch, his mind racing, each thought darker than the last. Was he imagining things, or was there something Clara wasn't telling him? The next few days passed with an air of quiet tension that Malcolm couldn't shake. Clara carried on as though nothing was wrong, but every interaction between them felt hollow. She seemed more preoccupied than usual, her laughter too quick, her smiles too strained. Malcolm tried to convince himself it was just a phase, that work was simply taking its toll on her, yet the unease lingered, growing stronger with every passing day. One evening, Malcolm decided to test the waters. They were sitting at the dinner table, the clink of cutlery against plates filling the silence. "So who was at the team dinner the other night?" he asked casually, not looking up from his plate. Clara hesitated just for a moment, but long enough for Malcolm to notice. "Oh, the usual group. Julia, Marcus, a couple of the newer hires, and Richard." The name slipped out before Malcolm could stop himself. He'd overheard her mention Richard in a phone conversation once, and the way she had laughed, soft, warm, almost intimate, had stuck with him. Clara's fork froze midway to her mouth. "Yes, Richard was there," she said lightly, but there was a faint edge to her voice. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," Malcolm said, forcing a smile. "Just curious." Clara gave him a look as if trying to gauge whether he was being sincere. After a moment, she shrugged and returned to her meal, but the brief tension between them lingered long after dinner was over. Malcolm couldn't let it go. The thought of Richard, whoever he was, gnawed at him. He began to notice how often Clara mentioned his name in passing, as if trying to normalize his presence in her life. She spoke of him with admiration, describing his wit, his charm, his ability to command a room. Each word felt like a dagger to Malcolm's chest. One night, after Clara had fallen asleep, Malcolm sat alone in the living room, staring at her phone on the coffee table. He knew it was wrong, a violation of her privacy, but his need for answers overpowered his guilt. With trembling hands, he unlocked her phone. She hadn't changed her password and opened her messages. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The texts between Clara and Richard were casual at first, filled with jokes and work-related banter, but as he scrolled further, the tone shifted. The messages became more personal, more intimate. There were compliments, inside jokes, and plans to meet outside of work. One message in particular made his stomach churn. "I can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." Malcolm felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. His mind raced, a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. He wanted to wake Clara up to confront her right then and there, but he knew it would only lead to more lies, more deflection. Instead, he put her phone back on the table and sat in the dark, his thoughts spinning out of control. Over the next week, Malcolm became a man obsessed. He began piecing together a timeline of Clara's behavior, comparing her excuses to her actions. He started following her social media more closely, noticing patterns he hadn't paid attention to before. He even drove past her office one evening just to see if her car was where she said it would be. It wasn't. The more Malcolm uncovered, the angrier he became. Clara's betrayal wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, a deliberate series of choices that she had made without regard for him or their marriage. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with had been leading a double life. One evening, Clara came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly mussed. She kissed Malcolm on the cheek as she walked past him, her perfume lingering in the air. "You're home late," Malcolm said, his tone neutral. "Sorry, the team ran late on a project," Clara replied without missing a beat. "Must have been a big project," Malcolm said, standing up from the couch. "Or was it just you and Richard?" Clara froze, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice defensive. I know, Clara, Malcolm said, his voice low and steady. I've seen the messages. I know everything. Clara's face paled, and for a moment, she looked as though she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and the mask she had been wearing for months finally cracked. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said softly, her voice trembling. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, Malcolm said, his voice cold. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything we had. For what? For him. Clara began to cry, but Malcolm felt no sympathy. Her tears felt hollow, insincere, a feeble attempt to manipulate him. He walked past her, grabbing his coat and keys. Where are you going? Clara asked, her voice panicked. Out, Malcolm said without looking back. I need to think. Malcolm drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, his mind a swirling tempest of anger and despair. Each thought came with its own stab of pain, memories of their life together flashing through his mind like cruel reminders of what he had lost. He pulled over in a secluded parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had built his world around Clara, trusted her with everything, and she had shattered that trust as though it meant nothing. The image of her and Richard together gnawed at him, fueling his fury. Malcolm wanted to confront Richard, to make him feel the humiliation and pain he was enduring, but he knew that was only part of the solution. This betrayal was deeper than a simple affair. It was the destruction of their partnership, their love, and everything they had built. Malcolm sat in the car for hours, the cold seeping into his bones as he tried to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, he made a decision. Clara had made her choice. Now it was time for him to make his. The days that followed were marked by an eerie calm. Malcolm returned home that morning to find Clara asleep on the couch, her tear-streaked face buried in a pillow. He didn't wake her. Instead, he went about his day as if nothing had changed, carefully masking the storm brewing within him. Malcolm began preparing in secret. He reached out to a lawyer, a non-nonsense woman named Veronica who specialized in high-stakes divorces. She listened intently as Malcolm explained his situation, her sharp eyes betraying neither sympathy nor judgment. You want to start moving your assets, Veronica said bluntly. Ensure that anything tied to you alone is protected. Leave nothing to chance. Malcolm nodded, her words steeling his resolve. Over the next week, he methodically closed joint accounts, transferred funds to his personal savings, and ensured that the house's deed was solely in his name. Clara had always trusted him to handle their finances, a fact that now played to his advantage. Meanwhile, he began gathering evidence of her affair. He printed copies of her messages with Richard, took screenshots of their exchanges, and even hired a private investigator to document their meetings. It wasn't about revenge, Malcolm told himself. It was about justice. Clara, oblivious to Malcolm's preparations, carried on as though their confrontation had never happened. She was quieter around him, her laughter more subdued, but the secrecy remained. Malcolm watched her with a quiet intensity, noting every lie she told, every moment she slipped away to be with Richard. One evening, as Clara was getting ready to leave, Malcolm decided to test her. Going out again? He asked, his tone light but pointed. Just meeting Julia for drinks, Clara replied, not meeting his gaze. Funny, Malcolm said, leaning back in his chair. Julia called earlier. She mentioned she was homesick. Clara froze, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment, she said nothing, and Malcolm could see the panic flicker across her face. I must have misunderstood, she said quickly, forcing a laugh. It's been a long day. Malcolm didn't respond. He simply watched her walk out the door, his heart heavy with the knowledge that she was walking straight into Richard's arms. The following day, Malcolm received the investigator's report. Photos of Clara and Richard together, holding hands in a dimly lit bar, laughing as though they didn't have a care in the world. Malcolm felt a surge of anger as he flipped through the images, but there was also a strange sense of clarity. The evidence was irrefutable. Clara couldn't deny the truth anymore. That evening, Malcolm waited for Clara to come home. He sat in the living room with the photos spread out on the coffee table, his heart pounding in his chest. When Clara walked through the door, she froze at the sight of him, her eyes darting to the table. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling. You tell me, Malcolm said coldly, gesturing to the photos. I think the evidence speaks for itself. Clara's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Malcolm stood, his eyes locking onto hers. I trusted you, he said, his voice heavy with pain. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me. Malcolm, Clara began, but he cut her off. Don't, he said sharply. Don't insult me with excuses. I've heard enough lies. Clara's tears came in a flood, but Malcolm felt nothing as he watched her break down. Please, she begged, her voice choked with sobs. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was lost, confused, and you found clarity in another man's bed. Malcolm shot back, his voice like ice. Clara, you flinched as though I had struck you. I made a mistake, she said desperately, but I love you. I want to fix this. Malcolm laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of any warmth. You can't fix this, Clara. You've burned it to the ground. For the first time, Clara seemed to realize the full extent of what she had done. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. As Malcolm walked away, he didn't need to hear her apologies. He didn't need to see her regret. The only thing he needed now was to follow through with his plan. As Malcolm climbed the stairs to their bedroom that night, he felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The confrontation had been the first step in taking back control of his life, but there was still much to do. Clara's betrayal had left a scar, and Malcolm was determined that she would face the consequences of her actions. The following morning, Malcolm quietly set more of his plan into motion. He visited their bank to finalize the transfer of funds into his private account. As he signed the paperwork, he couldn't help but think back to all the years he and Clara had worked to build their shared life. It was painful to dismantle it piece by piece, but it was necessary. Later that day, he met with Veronica again. She reviewed the investigator's findings, nodding with approval. "This will make the divorce proceedings straightforward," she said. "You're in a strong position." "Good," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. "I don't want her walking away with anything she doesn't deserve." Veronica's lips twitched into a small, approving smile. "I'll make sure of that." While Malcolm worked behind the scenes, Clara's life began to unravel. The financial restrictions he had put in place started to take effect, cutting off her access to their joint resources. She noticed first when her credit card was declined at a high-end boutique, a place she had visited with Richard just a week earlier. Embarrassed, she called Malcolm from her car. "Malcolm, there's something wrong with the credit card," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "There's nothing wrong," Malcolm replied calmly. "I closed the account." "What?" Clara's voice rose with disbelief. "You didn't even talk to me about it." "We don't share things anymore, do we?" Malcolm said, his tone sharp. "I thought you'd appreciate the consistency." Clara sputtered, trying to formulate a response, but Malcolm hung up before she could. He wasn't interested in her protests. Meanwhile, Richard was beginning to feel the heat as well. Malcolm had anonymously sent the evidence of their affair to Richard's company's HR department. The consequences were swift. As Clara and Richard sat in their usual coffee shop one afternoon, Richard's phone buzzed with an urgent email. "Something wrong?" Clara asked, sipping her latte. Richard's face darkened as he read the email. "HR wants to meet with me." "Do you think—" Clara froze. Richard shook his head, but his expression betrayed his uncertainty. "I don't know, but this could be bad." The meeting didn't go well. By the end of the day, Richard had been placed on probation pending further investigation. Clara's phone buzzed with his furious text later that evening. "Who the hell told them?" one message read. "This is going to ruin me." Clara felt a wave of panic. The carefree thrill of their relationship was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of consequences. She began to suspect Malcolm's involvement, but didn't have the courage to confront him. One evening, Clara found Malcolm sitting in his study, poring over old documents. The sight of him there, a man she had once trusted with everything, made her chest ache. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Malcolm," she began softly, "can we talk?" He didn't look up. "About what?" "About us," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to fix this." Malcolm finally lifted his gaze, his eyes cold and unreadable. "Fix what? The trust you broke? The life you threw away for Richard?" Clara flinched. "I don't care about Richard anymore. I just want us to go back to the way things were." "You can't undo what you've done," Malcolm said, standing and facing her fully. "You chose them over me, Clara, and now you're facing the consequences." Tears streamed down her face as she begged for forgiveness, but Malcolm's heart had grown cold. He no longer saw the woman he had once loved. He saw someone who had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. The next morning, Clara woke to find an envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a copy of the divorce papers Malcolm had filed. Her hands shook as she read through the document, realizing just how thoroughly he had planned his exit. The house, the car, their savings, everything was in Malcolm's name. She was left with nothing. Clara confronted Malcolm as he prepared to leave for work. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice breaking. "We built this life together." "No," Malcolm said firmly. "I built this life. You destroyed it." As he walked out the door, Clara felt a crushing sense of finality. She had lost everything. Her marriage, her stability, and even Richard, who had stopped returning her calls after his workplace scandal. She was truly alone. In the weeks that followed, Malcolm began rebuilding his life. He found solace in his work, in his friends, and in the quiet moments of reflection that came with being free of Clara's deceit. Though the pain of her betrayal lingered, he refused to let it define him. Clara, on the other hand, struggled to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She moved into a small apartment far from the affluent neighborhood she once called home. Her former friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the fallout of her choices. Each day felt like a battle, a stark reminder of the life she had thrown away.